And so we come to the culmination of medieval philosophy, the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas. His dates are 1225 to 1274. In some books, 1275. He has a monumental, ingenious philosophic system, more thorough, more systematic than any in all of philosophy prior to his time. In its key concepts, however, it is not very original. Throughout, it is an attempted synthesis of Aristotle and Christianity, or of Aristotle and Augustine. And therefore, you're already familiar with the basic ingredients, or at least the most basic of the basic, of his philosophy. What I want to do now is merely indicate some of the essentials by which he brought crucial Aristotelian views back onto the intellectual scene. I want to give you at least a rough indication of how he tried to reconcile Aristotelianism with Christianity. Now, I'd like to stress out of fairness that my exposition of Aquinas is going to be confined only to the broadest of broad surveys. If you tried a full presentation, even a half-full one, even a tenth-full one, you would have to be here 20 or 50 lectures. And I doubt that you want that. Now, this evening, I want to look only at Aquinas' epistemology. The rest of his system we will save for next week. Now, in epistemology, the main problem was to reconcile reason and faith. And Aquinas did so by saying we must distinguish two fundamentally different subjects: philosophy versus theology. Now, as he uses the term philosophy, and of course as all ancient and medieval philosophers use it, it includes not only what we call philosophy today, but also all the knowledge that we would put in the sciences. That's harking back to Philein for Sophia, love of wisdom. Philosophy is the subject that begins with the evidence of the senses and proceeds throughout strictly by reason and logic. Using the Aristotelian processes of observation, abstraction, definition, induction, syllogism, the definition of archai, first principles, etc. It is a completely natural subject which man can pursue by the use of his natural, rational faculty without any need for divine grace or illumination, says Aquinas in a radical departure from Augustinianism, and without any need for the dogmas of faith as its basic material. Again, a profound break with Augustinianism. Philosophy proceeds with the facts of this world as its data and primary object. In a word, philosophy is the subject which proceeds on secular Aristotelian lines. Theology, by contrast, is the subject which begins with the dogmas of faith, with the revelations, and then tries to explore and explicate their full meaning. Now, to a significant extent, these two subjects will have a different content, therefore. Philosophy is primarily concerned with the facts of this world and what it can learn from. Theology is primarily concerned with the mysteries of religion. There will, however, Aquinas thought, be a significant overlap between the two branches of knowledge. There will be many things that philosophy can prove rationally and which have also been revealed by God. So you have to think of two overlapping or intersecting circles. One contains all natural knowledge, all rational knowledge. One contains all revealed knowledge. And in the overlap are the issues which, as part of revelation, belong to theology, and yet as capable of independent rational proof, belong to philosophy. Now, this overlap area Aquinas called natural theology. Natural theology. The part of theology that can be proved by reason. And he thought it included the proof of God, of the immortality of the soul, and of several other important things. As to the part of theology which can't be proved by reason, the so-called revealed theology, what is its relation to reason and philosophy? And Aquinas' overwhelmingly important answer is, revelation can in no way contradict reason. It can maintain nothing that can be rationally refuted. Revealed theology simply supplements, that's the key word, supplements reason, by giving us information on subjects about which reason has nothing to say one way or the other. That's Aquinas' view. For instance, he says, take the question of whether the world was created at a certain point of time or existed eternally. Now he claims, from simply looking at the world, there's no way of knowing. So if you go simply by reason, you'd have to say, I don't know. That's false, but that happens to be his view. On that issue, therefore, he says, theology may properly speak. And when Scripture tells us that the world was created out of nothing, we're entitled to accept it, because it does not conflict with reason. It simply fills in a hole that reason couldn't answer one way or the other. They can't conflict, the two subjects, he said, because after all, God gave man both reason and revelation. And God, in effect, as a good Aristotelian, advocates the law of contradiction, and he wouldn't give us contradictory faculties. So that if someone claims to give a rational proof that one of the dogmas of faith is false or contradictory, reason must, said Aquinas, proceed to prove that the objection is invalid. And, of course, it will be able to do so, he believed. Now, of course, if the dogma is something that belongs only to revelation, reason can't prove the dogma is true, but it should be able to refute all of the objections and leave it simply from the point of view of reason, an open question, which we then appeal to theology to decide. Now, I think you see the significance of this view. It was the first for centuries charter of liberty and of liberation for human reason. Reason now has its own domain. The world revealed to man's senses, and whatever you can learn by reasoning about it. Reason is no longer just an appendage of theology. Its domain is a separate subject fundamentally, which proceeds on Aristotelian lines, on the basis of sense data, not of intuition of a world of forms. Reason is now secularized, naturalized. It is now autonomous because its data is experience, not faith. Reason's capacity to know truth, says Aquinas, is a natural power. Here, of course, he follows Aristotle. It requires no special divine aid, grace, illumination. In reasoning, man is on his own. He needs no special help from God in philosophy or science. Now, I hope you see the absolutely fundamental opposition between Aquinas' approach here and that of Augustine, to say nothing of Tertullian and his friends. For Augustine, faith is the basis of reason. For Tertullian, faith contradicts reason. For Aquinas, it is neither of these. Faith is not the basis or the antagonist of reason, merely a supplement to it. That's all. Now, by describing revealed theology as that about which reason has nothing to say one way or the other, by stating that faith is a supplement to reason, Aquinas implies, although that is not obviously his intention, he implies that faith is now on the defensive, because by his formula a thing goes into revealed theology only if reason is silent on the issue in question. But if reason has something to say, then, according to Aquinas, it must speak out. And if its arguments were unanswerable, then the alleged dogma couldn't be true. In other words, Aquinas' basic epistemological principle is the rational is an absolute which you must subscribe to. Now, in the face of any apparent conflict between reason and faith, Aquinas himself always took the line that the reason there was no conflict is because the intellect had made an error. The reason didn't really conflict. In other words, he never personally challenged the faith, obviously. But, given his formula, the way was open for others to say in the face of a conflict, it's the faith that's wrong, not reason, let's throw it overboard, which is just what happened. Now, of course, Aquinas didn't think a conflict would ever develop. But you know that it had to, and in fact, soon after him, it did. Pretty soon they found that reason had a great deal to say, and that it was mostly inimical to Christianity and to the whole medieval viewpoint. Now we have to leave Aquinas' epistemology at this point. I should say, just out of fairness before leaving it, that Aquinas is a very great epistemologist. If you strip off the theology, which is ever present, but if you can read apart from that, and he himself takes great pains to keep philosophy and theology very separate, and therefore it's very easy to strip off his theology. He makes many fascinating points on questions of detail. I would have to say that on a great many questions, lesser questions, but still vital questions, he is better than Aristotle himself. And now that's as great a compliment as you can pay a philosopher. I think offhand of one view of his on the method in detail by which the laws of logic come to be known by human beings. I think Aquinas' treatment of that question is superior to Aristotle's. If you're interested, you can ask me about that at some time in the question. Now, I've given you at least the broadest essential of his distinctive contribution to Christianity in the area of epistemology. Next week, I'll pick up with Aquinas' metaphysics, including his view of reality, of causality, his 5 famous arguments for the existence of God, and perhaps I'll have a minute to work in something about his angelology, his theory of angels, and then we'll look briefly at his ethics, and then we will trace the development from Aquinas through the Renaissance and on to the development of modern science out of the foundations laid by Aquinas. You've heard enough, however, at least to begin to appreciate Aquinas' contribution to the release and salvation of the West. And I mean salvation now in a rational sense, salvation from Plato and Augustine. And first, let us look at Aquinas' metaphysics. Before I tell you its central thrust, I want to say at the outset that Aquinas was never consistently Aristotelian in metaphysics, any more than he could, as a devout Catholic, be consistently Aristotelian in any branch of philosophy. In metaphysics, for instance, he believes that a supernatural dimension, God, is the creator and source of this world. He believes that God's mind contains the Platonic forms, just as Plotinus had said, and thus the Platonic forms for Aquinas are logically prior to the things in this world. Aquinas often, especially in discussing the problem of evil, inclines to a Neoplatonic view of the relative unreality of this world compared to the true reality of God. He believes in all the Catholic dogmas, the Trinity, the Incarnation, etc. Now, all of this you should bear in mind. Aquinas is not a pagan. He is not a pure Aristotelian, not in metaphysics and not in any branch of philosophy. He is simply as close to an Aristotelian as it is possible for a devout Christian to get. Nobody ever came closer to it than he did, if you're a Christian. All right, let's now, with that preface, turn to the distinctive Aristotelian elements in his metaphysics, the new approach in metaphysics that he brought to the Christian world. If the central problem in epistemology is how to reconcile reason and faith, the central problem confronting Aquinas in metaphysics is how to reconcile God and this world. You recall the Augustinian view that there are 2 radically opposite sundered dimensions. God, who is reality, absolute reality, perfection, and nature, or the physical world, which is fundamentally unreal, which is essentially the Neoplatonic absence, the place where the rays of the one, the light of God, have run out, so it's gotten dark. And this world, if you remember, for Augustine, was therefore a kind of gray, unreal, unsubstantial haze. God is absolutely opposite from this world. He is perfect in reality. This world is damned, unreal, corrupt. And yet Aristotle had said there was only one reality and that it was fully real. How did Aquinas reconcile these 2 views? Well, he took over from Aristotle the view that there is only one reality, but that it is hierarchical in nature. You remember Aristotle's view that there are various levels of reality, depending upon the extent to which form is actualized. Ascending from prime matter, the elements, the compounds, the plants, animals, men, the intelligences which move the spheres, and then the pure form, the prime mover at the very top. Well, Aquinas adopted this whole framework. Reality, he said, is not irrevocably sundered into two opposite worlds, God versus nature. No, there are not really two kinds of reality at all, he said. There's only one. The universe forms one single real totality, but it rises in ascending levels of actuality to reach God as its climax, who is at the top, pure actuality. In this sense, said Aquinas, it is right for a Christian to exalt God above the world, because God is the top of the hierarchy, after all, the supreme form. But, he insisted, this does not imply that we must metaphysically despise or degrade the world of nature that we live in, that we must turn it into some sort of degenerate dimension infected with non-being. No, he says, nature, the world we live in, is part of the one reality. It's merely a lower level of the one continuous hierarchy, rising unbrokenly up the Aristotelian ladder to God. And of course, the intelligences which move the spheres give way in Aquinas' view to the angels. In the famous expression which captures this view, grace perfects nature. Grace being the realm of God, nature the physical world, and whereas the Augustinian view had been grace destroys nature, the realm of God destroys or obliterates the reality of this world, Aquinas' view is God perfects nature. Now, this view is of enormous significance. It undercuts the metaphysical basis for despising this world. The earth, the natural world, with all of its creatures, including man, are now real. They exist. Now, it's very hard to communicate to you how revolutionary this perspective is. But that's Aquinas' big contribution. This world is real. It is. Everything is part of one integrated universe. You see, Aquinas, following Aristotle, equates the real with the individual, not with the universal. And there are therefore, in his view, no such thing as degrees of reality. There are degrees of complexity of structure. There are degrees of what Aristotle called actuality, but there are no degrees of reality in the Platonic sense. Everything that exists, including the world of physical entities, is fully and equally there. It is. It's real. In this respect, as an Aristotelian, Thomas agrees with Aristotle, who agrees with Parmenides. What is, is. If a thing is, then it is, the law of identity. Either it is or it isn't, the law of excluded middle. It can't sort of be and yet sort of not be, the law of contradiction. And the result is that this world gains, regains the solidity, the substantiality, the metaphysical stature, the reality, which had been shorn from it by the Platonizing Augustinians. This world is real. And therefore, the things in this world are fit and proper objects for human study. In pursuing science, we are again studying with and in contact with reality. We are not in Plato's cave watching the half-real, shadowy reflections. We are not in Plotinus' world watching the emptiness where the rays ran out. We are not in Augustine's world watching prope nihil, if you remember his definition of matter, almost nothing. We are in reality, and science is therefore a study of reality. Moreover, the earth is a fit place to live in. It's man's natural home. True enough, the realm of God is man's supernatural destiny, and that's more important, but still his natural home is a real home. It's a part of reality. It's not a place of exile from reality. As to man, and that means individual man for Aquinas, since he's an Aristotelian in this respect, man, too, gains a real metaphysical dignity on Aquinas' view. After all, man occupies a place rather high up on the metaphysical hierarchy. The angels and God, to be sure, are above man, but still within the natural world, man is the highest being. As it came to be put, man is the highest of the natural material beings and the lowest of the spiritual ones. But note that man is the only being who has a foot in both camps, who belongs to both worlds. As a living physical creature, he's a member of this world. But as a creature with an intellect, and as Aquinas thought, therefore, an immortal soul, and here, of course, Aristotle's immortal active reason was of great help to him, man is destined to a life in the spiritual hereafter. So man, so to speak, has a crucial metaphysical role to play for Aquinas. Man is the creature who closes the gap between the physical world and the world of God and the angels. He is the link which unites the two dimensions into one reality. The highest member of the one realm, who is also, by virtue of his immortal soul, a potential member of the other. You can think of it as though man, for Aquinas, is the metaphysical glue that keeps the universe stuck together. And we have to always remember this in speaking of man's supernatural destiny, as of course we must do as good Christians. We must emphasize that as good Christians. Nevertheless, says Aquinas, we mustn't forget that man is also a member of this world. There is not only a supernatural man with an otherworldly destiny, but a natural man with a this-worldly destiny. Now, the ethical implications of this you should be able to guess. Now, I've said that on this view of Aquinas, science is metaphysically possible again. And of course, it's epistemologically possible via the liberation of reason. But you might still ask me, well, after all, how is science possible? Because aren't all events still a product of God's will, according to Aquinas? Even for Aquinas, God created the world ex nihilo. That's a dogma, and he must subscribe to it. God has a plan. Everything happens as he ordains by his will. Everything in that sense is a miracle. It proceeds from God, from God's will. How then can you have science? Well, Aquinas dealt with this question too. And his answer was, true enough, everything is determined by God as part of his plan and by his will. But it so happens that God usually works through intermediate or secondary causes. An orderly, lawful, regular universe where entities act in accord with their natures is part of what God wills. A scientifically understandable universe is part of his plan. So ultimately, it's true, only God has causal efficacy. But he expresses it by endowing his creatures with causal efficacy. Now, of course, God can intervene directly at any time and dispose with the intermediate causes. He can simply point in a divine way to a rock and say, I want wine to come out, in which case that will be a miracle. But on the whole, says Aquinas, we should try to explain events in terms of natural laws and causes, just as Aristotle said, not by reference to God's directly willing them, although, of course, he does believe in miracles. Now, this view also was a charter releasing men to attempt to discover order and law in the natural universe. Now, let's turn to God. I want to mention Aquinas' famous arguments for the existence of God. Since these are arguments, it comes under what we called last time natural theology. That is, it's a theological subject matter, but it's arrived at exclusively by the secular reason. There are 5 famous arguments which Aquinas puts forth for the existence of God. None of them are original with him, and I cannot go into the details of them this evening. I will simply identify for you the main principle of each of them. Number 1 is the argument from motion. These are to this day the arguments of the Catholic Church in favor of God. The argument from motion is number 1, and that literally restates Aristotle's argument for the prime mover, arguing that motion implies a first mover, a prime mover, an unmoved mover, and therefore there's absolutely nothing new in that. 2, the argument from efficient causation. Now, this basically restates the argument from motion in different language, speaking of causes rather than motions. You remember Aristotle's definition of the efficient cause, the factor which brings about the existence or the motion of something. In the case of the example, we use the sculptor's actual shaping of the clay. Well, this argument goes like this. Everything has an efficient cause which brought it into existence, which is true enough. Next premise. Nothing can be the efficient cause of itself. And that's obviously the case. Nothing can produce itself or bring itself into existence. It first would have to exist before it could do anything. It follows that everything is caused by something previous, and that by something previous, and we'll have a whole series of causes stretching back, each caused by the preceding. But now Aquinas asks, what is responsible for the existence of the whole series of causes and effects? We can't have an infinite regress, or rather, to be exact, he says, there may be an infinite regress of causes of causes of causes. We know from faith that there was a beginning because God created the world. But as far as reason is concerned, perhaps the series does go back forever. Nevertheless, he says we must ask, what is the explanation of the whole series? Why is there anything at all? And that, you see, is the exact parallel to Aristotle's question, why is there any motion at all? And he concludes on exactly the same reasoning. There must be an uncaused cause, a first cause. Now, this introduces nothing new but the terminology. It's essentially the argument from motion transferred over to causality, and the same objections are applicable to it. The third is called the argument from necessity and contingency. And it goes like this. Some entities are contingent. By contingent, we mean here, it is possible for them not to exist, as against a necessary entity which would have to exist. Some entities are contingent. They come into being, they stick around for a while, they pass away. Now, Aquinas argues, it is not possible that all entities could be contingent. Now, to simplify his argument, what it comes to is, if every entity was contingent, that would mean existence as a whole could pass away. And of course, it can't. Therefore, something must be necessary. And if so, either it's necessary by its own nature, incapable of going out of existence by its own inherent character, or else it owes its necessity to something else. But again, we can't have an infinite regress, so ultimately there must be something which is absolutely necessary, which simply has to exist by its own nature. And this, he says, is what we mean by God, the absolutely necessary being. Now, in answer to this argument, I need merely point out to you that, first of all, it's based on the dichotomy between necessary and contingent facts, which Aquinas took over from Aristotle, who took it over from Plato. And since that dichotomy is false, the whole argument, in fact, can't get off the ground. But secondly, even if you were to grant that dichotomy, it proves nothing whatever about a God. Because a Greek could answer, well, fine. Why don't we say that the world's stuff is the absolutely necessary thing? And what you call contingent beings are merely different arrangements of the eternal, necessary world stuff. So we have a completely necessary thing, which has no supernatural associations and no religious significance. Number 4. Now, I'm whizzing through these pretty fast, but you get the idea. The argument from degrees. And it goes as follows. There are degrees of various qualities that we observe. Things vary, for instance, in heat, in size, in value, and so on. Where there are degrees of a quality, there must, Aquinas argues, be an absolute maximum of that quality somewhere, which is the cause of its existence in all the lesser degrees. Now, there are degrees of goodness, as we observe. Some things are better, others are worse. There must therefore be a maximum of goodness, which causes all the lesser degrees of goodness. An absolute goodness or an absolute perfection, and this is God. Therefore, there's a God. Now, this argument is generally the weakest of the 5. The premise of it, of course, namely that variation in degree implies a separate entity of the maximum amount causing the lesser degrees, has no plausibility. It actually rests on the Platonic theory of forms. You remember, for Plato, all the qualities here in this world vary depending upon how much they reflect the perfect form of their quality in the other world. So if there are degrees down here, that for Plato implies a maximum perfect embodiment of the quality in the other world. And you see, that's really the framework in which Aquinas is here arguing. So it's a thoroughly Platonic argument for God. And finally is number 5, the teleological argument, the argument from design, which we already mentioned several times. That argument is very simple. There is order in the world, Everything happens either always or for the most part, says Aquinas, following Aristotle's phrase. But order, as Aristotle showed, implies final causation, implies teleology. And, says Aquinas, teleology implies a conscious being who is imposing the purpose or end or goal on things. And therefore there must be such a cosmic consciousness, namely God, the cosmic designer. Now here, of course, the point to challenge is the Aristotelian view that order requires a final cause. And I criticize that in discussing Aristotle's teleology. I simply point out that Aquinas is superior to Aristotle in this one respect. If you grant final causation as a metaphysical principle of everything, then Aquinas is right. The only way to make sense of teleology is some sort of divine consciousness. And in that respect, he draws the conclusions from Aristotle's error. Well, we have to leave these arguments now. I just wanted to mention them in passing. You can today find an endless quantity of books expounding them in loving detail, so you don't need me for that. Now, a word about the nature of God. Aquinas, to his satisfaction, has proved the existence of God. He has to now face another task. He has to show that the God he has proved is the God of Christianity, not merely the prime mover of Aristotle. The argument from motion, for instance, proves, if it's correct, the unmoved mover. And if you recall, he's completely impotent and ignorant, unconscious of the world without any power over it, able to do nothing but contemplate himself, his own perfection from eternity to eternity. Now, how do you get from this God to the God of Christianity? Well, if we had a month, I would indicate some of the ways by which Aquinas attempted this feat. Of course, it is impossible. It can't be done. But to give you just one example, on the issue of does God know the world, Aquinas takes this line. He says, Aristotle's right. True enough, God only knows his own nature. He only knows himself. But we know that God is the creator of the world, and that he contains the archetypes of everything in the world in his mind, and therefore in knowing himself, he indirectly knows the world he created, and therefore God does know the world. Now you see that's pretty weak, because he has to resort to faith to establish that God created the world. So it's no longer natural theology. In the last analysis, Aquinas' view is that reason can prove the existence of God and can give us a few slender leads as to God's nature, but the real essence of God, insofar as man can know it on earth, depends on faith. So much for Aquinas on God. Now, I simply want to mention that I have to leave out Aquinas on angels owing to lack of time. But he had some interesting things to say about angels. So if you ask me in the question period about Aquinas' angels, I will be happy to tell you a few tidbits about the angels. Now let's conclude our brief survey of Thomism by looking at the main principle of his ethics. And here again he attempted to reconcile Aristotle with Christianity. Ethics has a dual nature, just as man does. Because man is in part a natural being living on earth as his natural home, a part of ethics will prescribe for that side of man. But insofar as man is a being with the supernatural destiny, there will be a part of ethics for that side of him. So there will be two types of virtues: the natural virtues, for man qua natural being, and the theological virtues, for man qua being with a supernatural destiny. And in Aquinas' opinion, these two sets of virtues do not conflict, because in fulfilling the natural virtues, in living well here on earth, he said, we develop and prepare ourselves for our supernatural destiny. And again, the idea running throughout his philosophy, the theological elements supplement the natural elements, they don't contradict it. As to the natural virtues, they are Aristotelian. Aquinas emphasizes, simply following Aristotle, self-realization, the all-round development of one's capacities, all the various moral and intellectual virtues we saw when we looked at Aristotle's ethics. You should live by reason. You should satisfy your natural, this worldly desires, at least to a moderate extent. You should not despise the body or the physical, and you should aim at eudaimonia, happiness on earth. This whole side of ethics, says Aquinas, the natural ethics is discoverable by reason alone. It comes under philosophy, not theology. And he says, at least to some degree, man by his own efforts can achieve the natural virtues. And we're still obeying God's will in following our reason in natural ethics, he says, because God, after all, is the creator of the rationality of the universe. So in obeying reason, we're still obeying God's will. Now, I always thought that God would have to be very surprised to discover that what he willed was Aristotle's ethics. But we can leave that for God to worry about. Now, this naturalistic side of Thomas's ethics released the whole system of Aristotelian, this worldly ethical values into the stream of medieval culture. For instance, even the virtues of poverty and chastity had to be modified, at least for most men, priests and saints exempt. Because after all, virtue is the golden mean. You can't go to extremes. And utter poverty and drinking laundry water and so on, that is an extreme. Now, if you want one touch illustrating the charter of liberty for human reason that Aquinas introduced following Aristotle, I want to refer you to his fascinating doctrine called the erring reason binds, E-R-R-I-N-G, the erring reason binds. Now, you remember the Augustinian view that you have to accept Christian dogmas whether they make sense to you or not. If you try to set up your puny mind above God's and to judge the rationality of the dogmas, that is depravity, intellectual arrogance, etc. Now, Aquinas, under the influence of Aristotle, takes a diametrically opposite view here. We cannot, he says, demand more of any man than that he honestly follow his own reason. Now, he was asked the question, well, suppose a man's reason errs, makes a mistake. Suppose the man honestly thinks that it's rational to endorse a certain belief or take a certain action, but in fact he's made an error, and the belief or action is against the church dogma. What should the man do? Should he suspend his reason and follow the dogma, or follow his own reason even if it conflicts with the dogma? To which Aquinas answered, a man must follow his own reason. Reason binds. You have to go by reason even if your reason has made a mistake, as long as that is your honest conviction. And that's the doctrine, the erring reason binds. Needless to say, the valid reason binds just as much. And here's a quote from Aquinas, quote, every will at variance with reason, whether right or erring, is always evil, unquote. Now that is certainly marvelous. And Aquinas himself gives the most startling example. We know that belief in Jesus, he tells us, is necessary to salvation. Nevertheless, he says, if someone honestly believes otherwise, he would be wrong to become a Christian. Reason is the absolute. It is in this respect even more absolute than the Christian dogma. Now you see how utterly opposite this is to the earlier Augustinian Christian viewpoint. Now, while there is this whole Aristotelian side in Aquinas, the other side, especially in ethics, is always there. It's often dominant, and you must not get the wrong impression. Beside the natural, rational virtues, there are the theological virtues. Faith, hope, charity. Charity, of course, is a translation of caritas, which means love, love of God. It's only after the 18th century that it came to mean giving money to beggars. These theological virtues, says Aquinas, faith, hope, and charity, cannot be proved by reason. They depend on God's revelation for us to know that they're virtues. They pertain to man's relation to God, not to life on earth. And they cannot be attained by us at all by our own efforts, only by God's grace. And here Aquinas accepted as a good Christian the whole Augustinian viewpoint, which had been, of course, proclaimed official church dogma. Man is stained with original sin. He requires God's grace to make a step in the direction of virtue. He's predestined to heaven or hell by God's inscrutable decision, etc., etc. All of which, as you can project, clashes constantly with the more Aristotelian side of his thought. If you want simply one sentence on politics, but I mean one, with a semicolon, it would be, just as grace perfects nature, so the church perfects the state. And just as God is supreme over nature, therefore the church must be supreme over the state. That is Aquinas' politics. I can't even say in a nutshell, but in an aphorism. Now, in this brief sketch of Aquinas, I've had to leave out almost everything he said, including all the ingenious ways in which he tried to reconcile Aristotle and Christianity in details. And I have not emphasized the Christian elements which exist in abundance in Aquinas. I've painted primarily the better Aristotelian side, because I wanted to isolate one element. For our purposes, what is crucial about him, to sum up, is this. He released reason. He affirmed that this world is real and it's man's natural home. He gave man a significantly added metaphysical, evaluative stature, and within the limits imposed by his dogmas, he advocated that man has some share in working out his own this-worldly destiny, that he ought to develop his human rational powers and, as far as possible, enjoy his present stay on earth. Now, this was in the 13th century. The 14th is the end of the medieval period and the prologue to the Renaissance. How does Thomas Aquinas say we arrive at the laws of logic? Yes, this I think is utterly brilliant on his part. You see, Aristotle's position, as he formulates, leads to a certain contradiction. Aristotle says, on the one hand, that we arrive at the laws of logic by induction. We perceive one instance of the law of contradiction, for instance, that this table is not both brown and not brown, and another instance, and after all we generalize, and then we see self-evidently that the generalization is true. Now, however, Aristotle also says that the knowledge of logic is required in order to know anything. And so the question is, how can you know the law of contradiction as a result of generalizing from instances of it, and at the same time say that you have to know the law of contradiction to know any proposition, including even the first instance of the law of contradiction? You see the problem. Now, Aquinas' brilliant solution was to say that the laws of logic do not come to be known by induction, but rather by abstraction. Abstraction not from instances of the law of contradiction, but abstraction from instances of the concept of being or existing. Said Aquinas, as soon as you open your eyes and have the first sense experience, you have implicitly the concept of being, existing, a thing which is. And as soon as you have that concept implicitly, you have implicitly, but really, actually, the awareness to be is to be. A thing is what it is, and therefore, by implication, contradictions can't exist. In other words, the process is not one instance of the law of contradiction, then another, then the generalization, but a sensation, then immediately the implicit concept of being, and thus by implication the laws of logic, and therefore in the first sensation, Aristotle is right, you do know the laws of logic, which I think is brilliant, because Aristotle had been attacked for being in an impossible snarl there for a long time. So I'll say simply two things about Aquinas as angels. Of course, he believed in angels. Everybody believed in angels at that time. So it wasn't even debatable. And he had them all arranged hierarchically, and if I remember, there was 9 orders of them, ranging from the lowest to the highest, and they had all sorts of different powers. And he pursued angelology systematically. He knew more about angels than any of us in this room know about living creatures. Now, he had many problems with the angels. Here's one. The angels are purely spiritual beings. They have no bodies, no matters. But matter is the principle of individuation on Aristotle's and Aquinas' philosophy. So the question is, what makes any particular angel this angel rather than any other, since he lacks matter? It lacks matter. You get the problem? How do you distinguish one angel from another if an angel is pure form? Now, Aquinas' answer was, no two angels have the same form. Now, think about that. It means that each actually belongs to a different species and is the only representative of its species that is possible. Now, of course, that reads a big question. Why call them all angels then? Do they have anything in common? If not, you shouldn't call them all angels. If yes, there has to be something that individuates and distinguishes one from the other. Well, he had a terrible difficulty with angels in this respect. And there again is the problem of trying to reconcile Aristotle with Christianity. The more interesting thing about angels, though, is the way they acquire knowledge. And this is very instructive. I was first taught this by Miss Rand as an epistemological lesson. She knows a great deal about Aquinas' angels, and she uses that expression all the time as a very helpful way of capturing something. The angels, not having physical senses, do not arrive at concepts by abstraction. They contact the forms in God's mind directly. Therefore, they grasp the abstraction in one act of contemplating the form. And, says Aquinas, in the act of grasping the abstraction, they thereby know every particular instance that will ever come under it. Now, the importance of this is, not that there is such a species, obviously, but it's very helpful to keep in mind because that is precisely what human beings are not. The essence of human epistemology is to grasp abstractions by a process of seeing a number of instances and abstracting. But the fact that you grasp the abstraction, even though you grasp it fully clearly, does not mean that you are automatically conversant with every instance that will ever come under it. You have to make a separate act of thought to say, now I know this abstraction and here is a new fact, therefore I put the two together and I come to this particular conclusion. And there's a great many cases of people who hear an abstraction, understand it, and then fail to apply it to some case and reproach themselves when they hear the answer on the grounds of, oh, I should have known that. Now, all that kind of guilt, assuming you've been not just stagnating intellectually, but you're doing your best, comes from the implicit assumption that you should operate like Aquinas' angel. And that if you know, for instance, that mind and body are integrated, you should know every blessed subdivision and sub-instance of that theory in relation to practice and idealism in relation to practicality and all the rest of it. And if you miss one, that goes to show that you're no good. That's a real source of guilt that should be abandoned. And the best way to abandon it is to follow Miss Rand here and say to yourself, I'm not Aquinas' angel. I have to, as a human being, grasp particulars by applying my abstraction by a new act of thought in each particular case. And the things I grasp, fine, and the things I don't, as long as I'm open and working, is not held against me. I found that enormously helpful when Miss Rand first taught me that, and to this day, everybody that I know uses the expression, you're not Aquinas' angel.